last week we talked about Job, right? No one better to start a topic of suffering than with Job. We're going to look at Jonah tonight, and you see there at the top, your first blanks. Whereas Job teaches a lot about not knowing God and suffering, Jonah is kind of the flip. He teaches a lot about knowing Him but not sharing His heart. And so we can know God but still be a bit rebellious there, right? And so that's kind of what we're going to see is it's important to know God, but it's also going to be important to share His heart. And we'll talk more about that as we get into it. So if you haven't already, turn with me to chapter 1. As you're doing that, I'm trying to think if there's any announcements. Hey, is everything good with the quizzes? Like online if you're doing that? I know there's some issues with emails. And I'll talk to Tom and figure out exactly how that works. I have no clue how that works. If you take the quiz in person, you notice I like to have fun with those. I even went to Walmart and bought a red pen, but I didn't have a red pen. I was like, these people are not going to take me serious. And I think your quiz was the first one I graded, and it was in black ink. And if you look at it, I went back and did everything in red over just to make sure you knew I was legit. All right, so Jonah is in Minor Prophets. Go there. All right, so verse 1, it says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. And so we see right there in our blanks, he's to arise and go, but what we're seeing in the next verse is he didn't go to Nineveh, he got up and he fled, ran away. So it says there, wickedness. Does anyone's translation say something different?
Evil.
Evil, okay. Yeah, so that word in Hebrew, what is that? There you guys go, man. So that's the word, ra'ah. It's going to keep popping up, and we're going to see it. I'm going to point it out. So the Ninevites' evil, the Ra'ah, has lifted up to God. This is the image, and it's got him in the face. So it hits him in the face. It says, before me, and that word there literally means his face. So it's come up to his face. I had a friend in college who had an English bulldog. And the thing, I like dogs, but this dog, he was gross. Slobber. I think he could have been taken care of a little bit better. But anyway, this dog would walk up to you and fart. And you wouldn't know. You didn't hear it. But all of a sudden it would just come up and hit you in the face. It was so bad. You just kick him away. You're like, oh. That's the image here. It's so bad. It has come up and has punched God in the face. It's hit him right in the nose. His evil, the evil of Nineveh. And so he says, Jonah, this is why I need you to go. But Jonah got up, he rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence. That word in Hebrew too is nose or face, presence. So the evil has come up to God's face, his presence, and he says, Jonah, I need you to go to Nineveh. And he says, I'm going to get away from your face. I'm going to escape your presence. And so right there it says flee. And there's nothing fancy about that. That just means to escape. He's escaping. He's on the run. And it says, so he went down to Joppa and found a ship that was going to Tarshish. Paid fare, went down into it to go with him to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. What do you think that word there is for presence? Face. Yep. So it's very emphatic that he's trying to escape God's presence. Now, when it says he went down to Joppa, that probably most likely means, that he was in Jerusalem when he got this commission from God. So remember the temple's in Jerusalem. That's where God lived. That's his house. And so he's in the Holy of Holies. That's his throne room. That's where God is when they thought, where's God? He's in his temple. So when he went down, I'm going to erase this announcement because I think y'all got it. So in the Bible, especially in the Gospels, every time they go down or go up, it's Jerusalem. So it's up on a mountain, and here's his temple. That's very accurate. So they would go up to worship, or they would go down. It's always up or down. So he's coming down. So that's just emphasizing he's trying to get away from the presence of God. And where's he going? Tarshish. So Tarshish, most take it, I think I put it there in yours, most take it as like the southwestern part of Spain. There's a city there, which is the end of the known world. But there's other places, and throughout history in the church and stuff, people have taken Tarshish to mean the sea. In the Midrash, which is a Hebrew writing, it's understood as the Great Sea. So he's going down from the presence of the Lord to the sea, and we'll say this is Spain. This is Tarshish. This is the end of the known world. So it's kind of interesting because we've been talking about the theme of darkness and sea, right? So what does the sea represent? What we've been talking about in creation and stuff like that. Chaos, evil. It's opposite of God. So it just emphasizes his trying to get away from God. He's trying to get away. Most likely it's a city. Tarshish sea doesn't mean sea, but it's been understood that way. I just wanted to point that out. But the idea, he's trying to get as far away from God as possible. And it says in verse 4 that the Lord hurled a great storm. I think I may have skipped some things. The point is him getting away from God as far as possible. Here's a question. What is Jonah's response to God's will? And we'll see it at the end, but he's unwilling to accept it because it causes him harm. And we'll see the harm that it causes him at the end. And a question for us is, does God will us to suffer? Or is it God's will that we suffer?
I think it's when we start trying to disobey him, when we decide to start making our own choices, that's when the suffering.
So you can see it, him allowing suffering in his will to correct us in that sense. Okay? Yeah, Hebrews 12. As a good father disciplines their son, that's what he's doing. So yeah. So I put yes and no. Because that's always a good way to answer hard questions. Yes and no. I put no in that God is not the author of suffering. It's not that he created suffering and evil, right? We've talked about that. That's a byproduct of sin entering the world and death. So he's not the author, but in that he's created it in order to harm us because he's a cruel God. But yes, in that he's the redeemer of suffering, in that he knows the world in which we live, that we will no doubt suffer in this world, right? Whether you're a believer, unbeliever, whatever, the way this world is going, you will at some point suffer. And so he builds that or involves that in his will for us. So his will does involve us suffering, which is not real exciting. But look at Jesus. Not even his own son was exempt from that. So that's one of those tough questions. And so you can always just yes and no. When God's will involves suffering, we can either accept it or we can escape it or run from it. I've done both in my life, and I would say you should, as hard as it can be, do your best to accept it.
I'm going to say you need to accept it. That's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, and we're going to see that from Jonah.
What was the answer answer to that? He suffers from the blank blank.
Oh, the will of God. Sorry. Yeah, so Jonah's response, he was unwilling to accept it. He's not going to accept it. He's going to escape it. He's going to run as far away as possible. And so in verse 4, it says, the Lord hurled a great wind on the sea. And there was a great storm, or a violent storm on the sea, so that the ship was about to break up. So when I was, I was going back and thinking about it, I was either 6, 7, or 8 years old, which would have put my sister like 4th, 5th, or 6th grade, okay? And I'm going to draw this out so for the people in the audio, I'll talk about it. In our old house, we had a living room. And so picture a square, audio people. And at the bottom of the square, there was a TV. And it was one of those like giant wood TVs, you know? You guys ever see one of those? It looked like a piece of furniture. It put pictures on it. It was just a big thing of wood. Anyway, so that TV was there on the bottom of the square. We kicked one out of the back of I don't know if you were there, out of the back of a truck in high school. Those things explode. Did not know that. Anyway, so if you go straight up, there's a couch directly in front of it. To the right was a fireplace. And then to the left of the couch, kind of at an angle, was a chair. The very top of the square on the right side was a hallway where my door was right there. In that hallway. That's my door. I don't know what I did. This was a lot closer. But I don't know what I did. But I bugged my sister. And I got her real good. I don't know what I did, but it was good. So good, I knew I needed to run. And she's standing in front of the TV. And I take off around the chair, around the couch. I'm running straight towards the bedroom. And as I'm running away from her, she picks up the remote. And the remotes back then are not. This is the actual size. Maybe not that big. But it had like, these were the buttons. Just, 2, 4, 6 tiny little buttons. And the rest of it was all batteries. And it was, and the plastic's not the plastic we have on our remotes. This was like thick plastic. You couldn't melt it if you tried. She picked that thing up and hurled it. As I'm running, and I'm laughing. And I know I'm home free. I'm as far from her as possible. I'm gonna lock the door. I don't know where Mom and Dad are, but
she was babysitting.
She dropped me right there in front of the door. This is what God's doing. Jonah's running.
The remote is God's will.
And picture God on his throne in his temple, you know my picture, up on his mountain. And Jonah's, he thinks he's home free. He's on the ship. He's in the bottom of it. They're going to set sail. He's on the sea. God and the sea they're not buddies. And so he's home free. And God's like hurling the storm, and it hits. And then in verse 5, make sure I'm following the notes right. So then verse 5, the sailors became afraid. Important word. They're afraid. Yoreh, they're afraid. And every man cried to his God, or his own God, and they threw cargo, which was in the ship, into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone below into the hold of the ship, lain down, and fallen asleep. So the captain approached him and said, "How is it you're sleeping? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned about us, and we will not perish." I think the question I have for you is, why did each sailor cry out to their own God?
They were scared.
Well, they're scared. What's going on? like themes again. They're
The gods were born.
hmm?
The gods were fighting. The sea was mad.
Close, yeah. So the sea's mad. It's chaos. It's said as a great storm. It's a violent storm. They're terrified. They know they're powerless. There's no way they have any power over the sea in this. So for them to cry, they knew the mythology we talked about of the different chaos comp, the different stories, and they all had their own gods and their own stories. And so they're like, we don't know which one's the supreme God. Let's all ask our own gods, and maybe we'll get lucky and get the right God who can overpower Yam, the sea. And so they even go and get Jonah, and they're like, wake up, call it to your God. And so they're calling out because they understand the whole mythology, because again, in their world, there's not just God work, like our God life, and then our day-to-day life. Like it's all mixed in together. Everything is manipulated by gods in their world. And so that's why they're doing that. Why does Jonah not seem scared?
He knew what he deserved.
Why would he be asleep? Who else in the New Testament is on a boat asleep in the middle of a chaotic storm? Why was he not scared?
He controls the sea.
Right, so why is Jonah not scared?
Figured he had it made being in the sea.
I figured he knew he had it coming.
I think that's a part of it. I think he knew, but why does he know? The answer is because he knows God's superior. He knows the creation story. He knows Genesis 1 verse 2. Because what does he say in verse 9? He said to them, I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord. There's the word fear again that we saw in verse 5. I fear the Lord has also the idea of worship. I worship the Lord, God of heaven, who did what? He made the sea and he made the dry land. He knows that God is superior to Yam. He's not scared of the sea. He's scared of who? He's scared of God. I just point that out because I'm always like, what is Jonah doing? He had to have been like freaking out. But I think it's because he knew, and that's why he talks about, what's the first thing he says about his God? The creator of the sea and dry land. Going back to that chaos comp of knowing who the superior God is. We don't need to go check on all these other gods, because I know who the God is that's superior. A point is in verse, we'll see it in 15, but our unwillingness to accept suffering will hurt us further. So if we don't want to accept it, and we want to fight God on it, we're going to get stubborn, we're going to try and run away, whatever that might look like in your life, it's just going to cause more hurt for us. And then our unwillingness to accept suffering, it also hurts those around us. Like the sailors, he's brought this on them. And not only does it hurt them, it hurts them like financially. They're losing their cargo. So it hurts them in the wallet as much as it hurts them emotionally, causing all kinds of PTSD. In times of suffering, we don't want to create more hurt on top of our hurt. We're like on the same page, right? I'm not skipping anything.
I think you skipped the last one on the first page, but I think we just.
I reworked
Yeah,
this.
just didn't get.
I reworked this, and I got so confused looking at two different documents that were like identical, and I was like, oh shoot, I just put that in the wrong, I gotta delete it.
Last question on the first page. Okay, I didn't know if I switched those words around.
Did you get it?
Being unwilling to accept God's will results in
Jonah's suffering? Is that what it was?
Is it more
I
suffering?
think it's more suffering.
Necessarily.
Yeah, I found it online. Results in more stuff. You guys, you'll get points on that for the quiz. Oh, I got carried away with my hurling the remote story. That's why I missed it. All right, so just kind of side note, we talked about grief and the different kinds. Last time we talked about Job's, how he had cumulative grief, right? Boom, 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 just all kind of compounded on him. What type of grief do you think we're going to see in Jonah? And this is the blank. Dan's thinking back there. He's holding that
I
beer.
knew I should have wrote those down.
Working that beard.
Yeah.
That was like the one thing I didn't write down was all the forms of grief.
So,
Is it anticipatory?
I mean, it could be because he's probably anticipating.
He knows who God is, so he's like,
Yeah,
"Uh-oh."
could be. But I think throughout the book, I think we see secondary grief, where by not accepting the suffering, he's creating a ripple effect of more suffering for him that takes it all the way through the story of chapter 4. And I put it like, there's a great storm in verse 4. In chapter 2, as we're about to see, they're drowning. And of course, he's swallowed by a great fish because he's drowning.
Is it a whale? Does it say whale?
It says a great fish.
That's what the Bible says?
Right, but they didn't have a word for whale. But God showing mercy on his enemies, that ticked him off. The loss of shade plant, we'll see that.
What
And
plant?
a shade plant. And then heat exhaustion. Yeah, and so God calls him, he knows God's will, he doesn't like God's will, it actually says it distresses him and causes him great displeasure, so he runs away. By running away, God hurls a storm, and then what happens as a result? What's the secondary grief? What do they do to him? They hurl him over into the sea. And he says in verse 12, he said to them, pick me up and throw me, or hurl me, into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that on account of me, this great storm has come upon you. And it says, however, the men rowed desperately to return to the land, but they could not, for the sea was becoming even stormier or even violent. So, and I get that. If the guy was like, hey, just throw me over and kill me, I'd be like, I'm not going to do that. Let's try rowing a little bit harder. Then they, in verse 14, they called on the Lord and said, we earnestly pray, O Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life, and do not put innocent blood on us, for you, O Lord, have done as you have pleased. So they picked Jonah up and hurled him into the sea, and the sea stopped raging. So that was kind of like, okay, he's got to go. But kind of like the wash our hands, like, God, don't hold this against us. So they throw him over. And then verse 16, the men feared, there's a word again, feared the Lord greatly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of this fish for 3 days and 3 nights. This is the first time, and we'll see it more in chapter 4, where God appoints something. So here he appoints a fish, which kind of goes back into the question, does God will us to suffer? Yes and no. God appoints a fish. That fish swallowed him. That led to some stomach acid issues on him, I bet, for 3 days that would burn. So yeah, God allows it in his will and takes control to redeem it, and he appoints certain things to happen in our life. But we're going to see that it's for our good, even though sometimes maybe we don't always see it or feel it in this life. And maybe we never will. All right, on to chapter 2. In the stomach, I titled this chapter. I think I'm going to start titling things now. In the stomach. So chapter 2 changes. It switches from what's called prose to poetry. So now we're going to do poetry. And I'm going to teach you a little bit about Hebrew poetry because I've got an hour to teach. And so I also think it's just cool to learn things about the Bible as we go. So there's different types of what's called parallelism in Hebrew. The number one main one that you'll see is synonymous parallel. Or synonymous parallelism.
I guess.
Yeah. I have to look that word up often. Synonymism.
Just ask.
Sin.
That's what I thought.
Synon. E. Oh, I'm questioning.
M-O-U-S. Yep.
M-O-U-S. Synonymous. I wonder what that means. So this right here is a prefix in Greek. And it means with. And I think this is onoma, which means name or I don't know. I think it means like same name in Greek. We'll Google it. All right, number 2 is antithetical parallelism. I can spell this one.
Is this on the test?
No. You can skip this if you don't care about hermeneutics.
I just meant failing immediately.
Antithetical parallelism. I'll tell you what these mean. Climactic is number 3. Number 4 is synthetic. You rarely see synthetic. Well, I shouldn't say you rarely see it. You rarely notice it. I don't even care to notice it when I'm studying because I'm like, the main one, like I said, is synonymous, and you see climactic. So climactic will be when you read the Psalms. You see these in the Psalms because it's poetry. You'll see it says, "Ascribe to the Lord, ascribe glory." So you hear the parallelism: ascribe to the Lord, ascribe glory. They're parallel, but it's this climactic type of parallelism. So that's easy to pick out. But if you move on in this poetry, it says in verse 2, "I called out of my distress to the Lord. He answered me. I cried for help from the depth of Sheol. You heard my voice." This is synonymous parallelism. Do you kind of see it? How the lines match each other? So think, I called out of my distress to the Lord, parallels with I cried for help from the depth. He answered me, parallels with you heard my voice. I'm also pointing this out because I think it's fun to see these things as you're reading, because then you get an idea of what the author is trying to show you as you're going.
So would that be with climactic?
Verse 2?
Yeah.
Verse 2 is parallel.
Parallel.
I don't know what it looks like in your Bible, but it's like, we'll say A, it's not in my Bible, it says I cried out, and then it says, we'll say B, and we'll say you heard, he answered me, and then A, what does it say? I cried for help. Now it's gonna get real sloppy, y'all. And then what was
You heard me.
you So sometimes these lines will be parallel, and sometimes people like Jonah will get real fancy and do this kind of parallel. There's no like hard rule in Hebrew poetry because we're looking at it in English. But and also like the idea of like when we do poetry, what are we trying to do? We're trying to rhyme. Like we're trying to be real clever and rhyme. With them, they're trying not to rhyme in sound, but in concept. They're trying to, if that makes sense. Though it does sometimes come out rhyming in their language. So going on, it says, "For you had cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea. The current engulfed me, all your breakers and billows passed over me." And so what we're seeing is deep and sea, that has the idea of death or Sheol. That's the blank there. Oh, let me go up. Jonah's distress, he calls out to God. That's the blank there. Oh, let me go back up to distress with a dash. That means in a tight place. It literally means in a strait. It also has the idea of being trapped, is what that word means. So it's any type of situation where you're stuck and you're completely helpless and you can't get out. That is the distress here. You are in a tight spot, and if without God, you're dead. And so in this place of desperateness, Jonah calls out to God. And Jonah's distress is parallel to Sheol. Sheol is the Hebrew word for the grave. So they, in the Old Testament, they didn't have heaven and hell. They didn't have that revelation. So they had Sheol, and that's just the place of the dead. And at the end of the age, the righteous would be resurrected to live forever. That's their idea of the afterlife back then. So we, obviously with progressive revelation in the New Testament, we have this idea of heaven, hell, new heavens, new earth type stuff. But that's what it means, Sheol. You'll see that in the Psalms also. It just means the place of the dead. Abraham's bosom in the New Testament, that's that idea there, that there's a place for both the righteous and the unrighteous. In that story, there's a big chasm, and the righteous were taken to heaven. All right, so the currents and breakers and billows, that's chaos. So we're picking up on this chaos. So again, we see the pre-creation themes of sea and darkness that oppose God. And Jonah is in the middle of it. And so who does he call out to? The only one who's superior over the sea and darkness and death, and that's God. And here's Jonah's response. Jonah praises God for his answer in verse 2. I'll mention that again in chapter 4. So he praises God for his answer. In verse 6, Jonah praises God for delivering him. "You brought my life up from the pit," is what he says.
What is currents, breakers, and billows?
Chaos.
What's deep and sea?
Sheol. Death. You guys are making me better.
Let us know if we need a folder of questions for the end.
I'm so bad at following blanks. Verse 9, Jonah ascribes salvation is from the Lord. Because I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving, that which I have vowed I will pay. Salvation is from the Lord. Then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up on the dry land. And the point here that I want to make is, Jonah is very quick to receive God's grace. As I think all of us would be. All right, on to chapter 3. Second time. I could have done better there. A second chance. All right. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to it the proclamation which I'm going to tell you." So what did Jonah do this time? Jonah arose and he went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was exceedingly great city, 3 days' walk. Then Jonah began to go through the city 1 day's walk, and he cried out to God, saying, or he said, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown." So there's a debate like, what does it mean 3 days walk? Is it 3 days walk around the walls, or is it 3 days walk through all the city? I think it's 3 days throughout the city, because it makes the point to say that he only made it 1 day of preaching before everyone's like, he starts talking about this Jonah guy. So he didn't even make it the next 2 days. So he really didn't preach but 1/3 of the city, but the whole city, the message spreads. So blanks, Jonah rises and goes this time. Jonah's message, 40 days, and Nineveh will be overturned or overthrown, flipped on its head, any of those words. And what is Nineveh's response to God? Or to the message? Verse 5, they believed in God, and they called a fast and put on sackcloth from greatest to the least of them. So you're jumping ahead with the story, but they believe God and is spared. Nineveh responds, believes God and is spared. Yeah. That's what we're doing about. So when Nineveh turned from their evil, in verse 10, it says, when God saw their deeds, that they had turned from their wicked ways, then God relented concerning the calamity which he had declared that he would bring on them, and he did not do it. So here we have that raw word again that I erased. So it says that they relent from their evil, and I have it here. This is good. It helps us. So this word has a range of meaning, like a lot of our words do. So if I say trunk, what do you think of? A tree trunk? Did anyone else think of something else? A chest trunk or a car trunk? Yeah. So the word trunk has a range of meaning, right? And we get that through the context. So we look at the context. Is talking about a tree trunk, we're probably not going to think of a car trunk. So that's how we figured out. Same thing in Hebrew. But I'm just saying that ra'ah on one end can mean evil, but we know God doesn't do evil. God's not going to send evil. So it has also the idea of calamity or judgment. And so the thing here is, because they turned from their ra'ah, God relented from his ra'ah. It's just something that the author's doing here to keep you engaged if you're reading through it. So did Noah go the second time willingly? What do you think?
Yeah.
You think he was happy about it?
No.
No. So he went, but he went unwillingly. So look at chapter 4, object lesson for all. Verse 1, but it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. So Jonah was greatly displeased and angry. There's your blanks. Displeased literally means, this is what it means in the Hebrew. It says, it was evil to Jonah, a great evil. And I don't know why they didn't do that, because that sounds pretty cool. Instead, they just translated, he was upset. But that, what it's saying is, it was ra'ah to Jonah, a great ra'ah. God relenting from his judgment for calamity, ra'ah, in verses 8 and 10 of chapter 3, Jonah turns around and says that was evil of God. He should have just wiped those sinners out. So Jonah is calling God's grace evil. The same grace he praised God for in chapter 2 for saving him.
But I don't think he thought that they were gonna turn that quickly. back to God. That was his hopes.
We'll see.
Oh, okay.
And that was
To the
wasting
end.
his time to go over there.
You know, people think he didn't go because, so, like, Nineveh, modern day, like Syria, Iraq, and they're pretty wicked. Like, they were evil people. Like, remember when ISIS was running around over there? Yeah, they were worse, probably. And so people were like, well, I wouldn't blame Jonah because I wouldn't want to go over to Iraq and preach to them because they'd probably kill me. And they probably would. But that's not what Jonah is, that's not why he ran. But we'll see here in just one verse, actually.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're good. Angry means to burn. It literally means he was burning. So again, Hebrew has that range of meaning. In Hebrew is fun because it's what's called the language of appearance. So they say things that they see and then they get their, it's an old language, archaic. So the word for anger is also nose. Because when you're angry, what do you do with your nose? So they see someone's nose moving, they're like, oh, nose! Nose! Run! Nose! So he's burning, he's angry. In chapter 3, verse 9, it says God cooled from his anger. But we see here Jonah is burning. So Jonah again is opposite of God. He is not sharing God's heart. He is angry. God cooled from his judgment, his wrath, and now Jonah is burning. And so why did Jonah try to forestall or prevent God's will by running? Verse 2, you want to read it, Sherry? I'll do it. I hate people calling on me to read. Oh, I hated that at school. You're like in the circle and you're like counting. Like, it's like 5 people and me. How much longer? I might be able to get out of this without reading. That was me. Anyway, verse 2, he prayed to the Lord and said, please, Lord, was this not what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled. I escaped to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious, compassionate God, slow to anger, abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning Ra'ah, or calamity. He didn't go because he wanted them all to die. He knew that if he went and preached God's message, that they would believe, and he did not want that. And so he goes, because after you get swallowed by a fish for 3 days, God means business. So he went the second time, unwillingly, but he went, and this is why he's all upset. This is why he thinks that it was evil to him that God would do this, because they didn't deserve to be spared. They deserved to die. Let's see. You probably guessed it. He knew God was abundant in loving kindness and relents concerning judgment. Jonah knew God would be gracious. Most people have a crisis of faith in suffering because they don't know God, and God becomes very confusing to them. Jonah is not that. Jonah has this crisis of faith because he knows God, he knows exactly what God is going to do, and that kicked him off. And that was his initial suffering, the will of God. It was God's will that they would believe and be spared and become Yahweh worshipers, those dirty, stinky Ninevites, Gentiles, and he didn't want that. And so that's why he thought it was an evil. Blank is, but he didn't share God's heart. He had a crisis of faith because he knew God, but he didn't share his heart. In suffering, it is not only important to know God or who God is, but to share his missional heart. Remember, we started this whole thing off with the theology of what? Theology of suffering is missional. God's doing something in suffering. Don't always know why. We see it in people's stories, but not in every story. At least, doesn't mean it's not happening, but that's what God's up to. God's response to Jonah's anger for his grace. He says, do you have a good reason? Jonah's like, take my life. This is horrible. Verse 4, the Lord says, do you have a good reason to be angry? And notice, Jonah doesn't answer him. Jonah answers in chapter 2, right? He praises God for answering him. But here, God talks to him. He's like, no, I'm not talking. And it says, verse 5, Jonah went out from the city. He sat east of it. And there he made a shelter for himself and sat under it in the shade until he could see what would happen to the city. And so he's hoping, right there under Jonah does not answer, Jonah hopes that the Ninevites are actually going to be like, never mind, he's gone, and reject God's grace and go back to their evil ways. And he's up there waiting for fire to come down.
Is that kind of like movie Armageddon, when Rockham's sitting on that asteroid? I think he's heading to crash the Earth. They have a fence seat.
Yeah, but I don't think he's going to crash. But yeah, he's getting a good seat for it. And then what does God do in verse 6? So the Lord God appoints a plant. So here's the second time we see God appoint something. God appoints a little plant.
Why is this designated? Like the same thing as
Yeah.
earlier?
Do you have the NSV 2020?
Yes, right
I can't make the switch. I just can't do it. I'm still 95 guy.
there.
Just like the 90s better. So he points to a little plant, and it says, it grew up over Jonah to be a shade over his head to deliver him from his discomfort. Discomfort in Hebrew is ra'ah. And how does Jonah respond? He was extremely happy about the plant because it delivered him, saved him from his ra'ah. In verse 7, but God, what did he do? He appointed a worm. God's so funny. He's like, yay, here comes the worm. So God appoints a worm. He appoints a fish, a plant, and now a worm. And when dawn came the next day, it attacked the plant and it withered. I have no idea where we're at with this. I'm just reading the Bible. So yeah, God appoints a worm to attack and kill the plant. The sun came up, and God did what? He appoints a scorching east wind, a hot wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head so that he became faint and begged with all his soul to die, saying, death is better to me than life. He sounds dramatic. Jonah's not a happy guy. But this is why Jonah didn't want to go. That's why he fled to Tarshish. Jonah is angry because he lost the plant that delivered him from his discomfort. That plant that saved him from his ra'ah, he's upset. God's response to Jonah's anger over the plant says, do you have a good reason? He asks the second time, do you have a good reason? And he said, I have a good reason to be angry, even to death. It's a great answer. So I am angry. So what his answer shows us his compassion for the plant, right? Jonah had compassion for a plant that delivered him from his discomfort, but was angry with God for having compassion on people to deliver them from their evil. You see, kind of trying to pull out the word plays and stuff. God had no interest in delivering Jonah from his discomfort, but delivering him from his evil heart. That's what he cared for about Jonah. And that's true for me. I get so ticked about little things in my life that don't go my way. Come on! You know? And God's like, I got something better for you. There's something I want to change in you. And I think I see that in Jonah here. I can act like a drama queen Jonah. The plant! I kill every plant in my house. So I don't blame God for that. But there's other things that are important to me that I feel. strongly about at times. The irony of Jonah is he was very quick to receive God's grace, but not quick to extend it. And in this way, Jonah is an object lesson for all of us who gladly receive God's grace, but then sometimes we're a little hesitant to extend that grace for a number of reasons. But that's not an excuse, because we're called to be image bearers of Jesus. The grace that we've seen, 2 Timothy 2:1, not 2:2. So 2:1 says to be strong in the grace, which is in Christ Jesus. So we're supposed to be strong in the grace that we receive. We're supposed to be strong in giving that over to others. And here's a good hint, you should do it when you think they don't deserve it. That's when you know it. I need to do it. Because that's what grace is. It's getting what you don't deserve. So what do we see? Jonah suffered unwillingly by not accepting God's will, and God's will was still accomplished. God's mission still advanced. And here's some ways that we see it. Bullet point, Nineveh believed and was saved physically. So God's mission in the world is advanced, because we're seeing people coming to faith, becoming Yahweh worshipers. And that was, going back to Exodus chapter 19, that was why Israel was redeemed. It says that they would be a kingdom of priests, that they would be mediators between God and the nations, that they would be a light to the nations and bring people in. But what does Israel do? They're like, no, we've got the covenants, we've got the promises, not you, you Gentiles. And so God is using Jonah as an object lesson to the nation of Israel, that this isn't his heart. But it also counts for us too, because his mission hasn't changed. Though we're not Israel, we're still God's people advancing his mission in this dispensation. The second bullet point, the pagan sailors worshipped Yahweh. I always find it weird saying pagan. I feel like an old Southern Baptist preacher. The pagans. But I know what to call them. The idol worshiper sailors. The pagan sailors worshipped. So in verse 9, we see that Jonah feared / worshipped God. Yahweh is the word there. And then verses 5 and 10, the sailors feared Yahweh death. But then how does that little story end? The sailors feared / worshipped. So you see the nuance of that word. It's kind of hard because we're just seeing the word fear, and we will automatically categorize it how we would feel. Obviously, Jonah is a worshiper, so he fears, has reverence for God, but these pagans, they were scared that they were going to drown, so we put that terror feel. But it's this idea of this, they had a transformation, now that they feared the Lord, and they worshipped and made vows to him, in verse 16. Jonah was delivered from his evil heart. It does not say this in the story, but tradition has that Jonah stayed and ministered to the Ninevites until he died, which would correspond to about the time they started getting wicked again. And I mentioned ISIS. Remember, I already asked, remember when ISIS was over there? They destroyed the it's not a temple, what do you call it? The tomb. The tomb. There was a tomb in Iraq to Jonah. And the tradition was that's where he was buried. And ISIS came in and destroyed it, like everything else over there. So that's the tradition, is that he stayed and worked among the Ninevites until he died. And if that's the case, then Jonah was delivered from his evil heart. He got over that discomfort. Jonah teaches us when we don't share God's heart, we create more hurt on top of our hurt and miss out on the joy of partnering with God in his mission. You see this, if you have kids, you see this. You say, hey, do you want to do this? It's going to be a lot of fun. And like, no, I don't want to do that. And then it happens without them. And then they're like, man, I missed out. You're like, oh, so. It's kind of the idea. It's going to happen. Who do you want to be in the story? Do you want to experience the joy of partnering with God and see him do crazy things that work miracles you didn't even know would happen? Or do you want to be like, no, that sounds not very comfortable or inconvenient, or I've got a very busy list today? I don't know. It's going to happen. And I think the bigger point is when we're going through something, is to constantly be work in our heart to be a heart that's willing to accept whatever it may be in order to experience whatever joy there might be in partnering with God to accomplish His will. Easier said than done. How should we respond when suffering arises that we are unwilling to accept? We're going to talk more about this later on, but give your request for it not to happen. You don't want it to happen? Tell God. Say, hey, I'm not liking where this is going. I feel like you're calling me into something I'm not comfortable with, or this is scary. Follow the model of Jesus. Let this cup pass from me. But it has to be coupled with number 2, which is then give yourself over to God's will. But not my will be done, but your will. That's the Jesus model. And by following this model, here's what I, in my experience, have experienced. You will limit your own hurt. By saying, God, I don't want to do this, but then submitting anyway. You will limit your own hurt. You will spare others' hurt. You will share God's heart. You will experience God's joy. And you will advance God's mission. It's going to happen. Might as well be a part of the cool story. And then there's some exercises you can think through or whatever. I put in the italics, I put my own answer. Like, what scares you about God's will when it comes to suffering? For me, the fear that life will never be the same. That we just won't go back to how everything is. But we like life, but if we follow you in your will, it sounds like a pretty scary deal that we might not ever make it back to where we are. Another one is fear that the loss may be too great to handle. There's certain things that if I thought could happen, I don't think I could handle it. But how can we work through these fears? And I put some stuff here that I do. Something that I think is, or tell myself, there's nothing God is calling us to endure, or for you to endure, that one, He isn't going to stick it out by your side, and He'll never leave or forsake you. And He isn't powerful enough to sustain you. A couple minutes before I pass out the answers to the next quiz. He isn't powerful enough to, did I word that right? There's nothing God can do. Yeah, so the idea that He'll sustain you in it. How that's looked in my life is like just going through the Psalms. Psalm 119, over and over again. If you read it, it's a long one, but if you read it, you'll see where He says, revive me, Lord. And then revive me. I remember reading through that as a prayer, and that revive me always popping out because I really needed to be sustained in what I was going through. And I didn't know where to get that power or energy to actually keep going. You know, there's times where we're just going to hit the wall, we're going to bonk out, as the runners call it, and just can't move anymore. And when you can't go forward anymore in your faith or whatever it is you're going through, I would say go to the Psalms. There's been no greater thing I've ever done in the worst places of my life than just read through the Psalms and make those words my own words and those prayers my own prayers. Because chances are what we're going through, maybe not the particulars of the details, but what we're feeling, what we're suffering has been felt for thousands. For as long as there's been humans, there's been suffering. And those emotions have been felt. And the Psalms have been good because when I don't have words for what I'm feeling, I can't put words in a prayer to God. I read the Psalms and they give me those words that I can pray that I don't have in those moments. So that's just a little trying to make it more practical.
Thank you.
All right, any questions about Jonah? Did we hit all the points? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean,
Chapter 1, verse 17. It seems like when the street talk, they don't understand. And he was swallowed by a whale.
on who talk? What did you say? On 17, the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah.
Okay, good.
I understand he prepared great fish, but it's referred to in the Gospels as a whale. And in our common mind, we see a whale out there, and we think, well, there's no way he could swallow a human and live 3 days.
Well, there's some big whales, like a sperm whale's pretty big. I don't know what kind of
Here
whale it
that
is.
he prepared a great fish, not necessarily the one that's out there now. In my mind, that's what happened.
Yeah. I don't know. Are you asking about the difference in words in the New Testament? How he says
Well, and in the Gospels, it refers to it as a whale.
yeah. Is that King James?
Pardon?
What translation is that? Is
King
yours-
James.
Whatever,
He reads King James.
Read the King James.
Yeah, there's different translations for that word. And so, did you know in the King James there's unicorns? Yeah. Because in the old English, what would you call a rhino? Has one horn. It's a unicorn. They changed that later on, because that got real confusing for people. So. But yeah, that's, anyway.
So did God send suffering to Jonah when he killed the plant and sent the hot wind?
Yeah, he appointed, that's what I was trying to say, is that it is in God's will to appoint adversity and trials, because he's going somewhere with it. And I think with Jonah, though it's not in the story, because that's not the point of the story. The point was to be an object lesson to the nation of Israel, because they had become very inward, selfish. We're God's chosen people, you're not, you don't deserve to be a part of the blessings. That wasn't God's plan for Israel or the nations. So Jonah's getting on to them for that, or God's getting on to them through Jonah. But I do think how it worked out was in that it, one, exposed Jonah's self-righteousness and his stinginess with God's grace, but it also, I think God used it not just to point it out in him, but to change his heart, to be a heart that would share his. I can't, in individual specific sufferings that people go through, if you were to ask, did God send that? I'd say, I don't know. I do know that in God's will, he allows it. There's nothing that's going to happen that's not outside of his sovereignty, his control, or power. And that can be a problem for me and others who see intense suffering and think, well, if God's in control, then why is he allowing this to happen? I don't know. And we're going to actually struggle with some of those questions as we get further on. We're building a foundation. I don't know what I did with I even put a paperclip on it, so I'm like, that is the quiz for people.
But it still seems like God's being compassionate and trying to teach Jonah. Because it's like, why are you angry? You know, trying to point out
Yeah.
his grace, and he's not extending grace.
It was yellow or a weird green.
It's on the back side of that paper, those papers there.
You get so many points. So for the people in the audio, I don't think I've been very helpful to them. I've not got any sort of bad feedback, but I was thinking about it. So I'm going to read the answers, so people who are doing this online or to the audio, they can get the answers. Number one is, how does Jonah first suffer? Oh, let's see, that's a type of, it says suffering. How does Jonah first suffer in his story? He suffers the will of God, or from the will of God. God's will comes to him, he doesn't like it, it's not what he wants, this displeases him, and so he runs, and then the secondary suffering follows. Number two, what was Jonah's response to God's will? Unwillingness to accept it. Number three, being unwilling to accept our trials can result in more what? More hurt. Our selfishness and suffering also hurts others. What does Jonah do with God's grace while in the great fish? Joyfully receives it. What is Jonah's response to the Ninevites believing in God and being spared? He's displeased. You could even put where was it? It was a great evil to him. Displeased, those the answer for the online people. God's anger cooled when Ninevites believed, but Jonah's anger burned. Jonah was quick to accept God's grace, but not quick to extend it. Burned, extend, and the next one are fill in the blanks. Jonah knew God's character, but did not share his heart. This goes in the blank. The last one, number 10. How was the mission of God advanced through Jonah's suffering? An entire city believed in God. You could put Nineveh believed. You could even put the sailors believed and worshipped. That'll work. Online though, you should probably put an entire city believed, because I'm not sure how that works.
Okay, picture.
Oh yeah,
Sorry.
pictures.
I have a question that's probably unrelated, not important.
No,
But
I'm sure it is.
The very last verse of
It's
the last chapter of Jonah, the last little phrase always seems so random to me, as well as many animals, that part.
Yeah. So, and look up in 3, it talks about they put on sackcloth, covered themselves with sackcloth and ashes, and he says, do not let beast, herd, or flock taste a thing. Do not let them drink water. Like, don't even, like, we're going to do a fast. Don't even let your animals. In 3, that's just, they're so serious about letting God know how sorry they are for their evil that they're not even going to let their animals break a fast. But here with the animals, what God's saying is, because he says, I'll just read the last verse. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know the difference between their right hand and their left hand, as well as many animals? He's just showing like how compassionate he is. Like, why would, like, even the animals, like, not that the animals were saved, but they probably were saved because he didn't bring like probably like fire down. But yeah, the idea is just like, you know, you care about plants, I care about people, and even their animals. Like, does that help? Yeah. It's just a weird thing to say, like, God cares so much for the Ninevites that he even cares about the animals.
Because of their, because they care about their animals, so
Yeah.
also.
Well, and the animals too signify like how sorry they were for their evil. That they put on sackcloth and ashes, which is what you do for mourning, to show how sorry you are. And they went into a fast, and they weren't going to break the fast until like they either died or God forgave them. And so they were so serious that even their animals were going to fast. But it just shows, I think the animal part, it just shows God's grace. And even the animals. God has compassion even on the animals.
Do you feel like there's like suffering in this world because like if he took away all suffering, like a clean slate almost, like someone would be unhappy anyway, like suffering would kind of build back up. I don't know if that makes sense. Because like,
It's a philosophical question.
I'm sorry.
No, I like it.
It's-
My undergrad's philosophy.
It's kind
Not a
of
great degree to get.
like one person maybe likes their lawn green,
Yeah.
another person likes their lawn brown.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So like, if God fixed their problems, then they're upset. Like,
Yeah, I get you now. So I think that would happen, and that's why when God fixes everything, he's going to fix it by getting rid of what the last, we talked about 2 ago, the last enemy is death. And so death, sin are the final ones to be done away with after, we read Revelation. Because it's from those things that evil and suffering come in, right? Now, you're talking about not an evil suffering. You're talking about like a displeasure
I just
kind of
mean
suffering.
like suffering in all ways, cause like I don't know.
I think in the I think in the new heavens, new earth, when he makes everything new and there's no more suffering, I don't think we're gonna be displeased. I think we're gonna be in that eternal state, so we're not gonna have evil kind of pop back up in that sense. But I think you're right, in this world,
Yeah, in this world.
if he were to just like, all right, let's just start over. Yeah, because we live in a fallen world.
Because the why would just be because that's how it is, right? Like that's why there is suffering, just because that's what the world is that we live in.
Yeah, and that's why with God's will, he doesn't will us to suffer, but his will involve suffering, because we will, without a doubt, suffer because we're in a fallen world. So for God to, for his will, for none of his believers to suffer, he would have to almost take us out of the world in a way.
Which is what he's gonna do at some point.
Is what he has to do.
That
Yeah.
makes sense.
That's a good question. I feel like we should have been drinking coffee right now.
At the coffee house.
Yeah. Alright. Anything else? Another tough questions? Next time we're going to see Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is going to be the flip. So whereas Jonah, he suffered unwillingly, Jeremiah is the prophet who suffered obediently. And Jeremiah suffered a lot. His nickname is the weeping prophet. So we'll check that one out next week.